Jon Macks became a comedy writer in the most roundabout way. He had quit law to become a political strategist. He won two huge campaigns, but then his luck turned on a dime and he lost 23 straight elections.
It's almost self-fulfilling that what happens is that when you are on a losing streak, no one good will hire you. And so they don't have much money. They can't win the campaign. They don't have the skills. And so then you rack up another loss.
Max started writing jokes when he was on flights. One thing led to another, and Max became one of Jay Leno's most successful writers on The Tonight Show for 22 years. Hello, everyone. I'm Chitra Ragavan, and this is When It Mattered. This episode is brought to you by Good Story, an advisory firm helping technology startups find their narrative. Joining me now is Jon Macks. He's considered one of the greatest comedy writers of all time by the likes of Billy Crystal, Steve Martin, Chris Rock, and Martin Short, just to name a few. Max has written for 22 Academy Awards. He's written material for high profile clients, including Helen Mirren, Michael Douglas, Hugh Jackman, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and others. The author of 5 books, Max also is a Democratic political consultant and a speechwriter for political candidates and even some U.S. presidents. Jon, welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be here.
When you told me earlier that you had won 2 races followed by losing 23 races, my first thought was, wow, people really trust this guy. They keep hiring him even when he's consistently losing campaigns. How did you convince people to keep hiring you?
Well, it was actually a little bit less of convincing people that I was really good and getting people who were really at the bottom of the barrel. It's almost self-fulfilling that what happens is that when you are on a losing streak, no one good will hire you. And so they don't have much money. They can't win the campaign. They don't have the skills. And so then you rack up another loss. So basically, at that point, you're in a position where you have to somehow convince one person to take a chance on you. And generally, and at least for me, that worked out the same way it worked for James Carville. We ended up working for a guy named Bob Casey. The governor Bob Casey had run for governor 3 times and lost. So basically, no one really wanted to work for him when he ran for a 4th time. No one would hire James Carville, who had never won a race, and no one was really interested in hiring a guy who lost 23 straight. So we were a perfect combination.
So you then ended up getting back on the horse and you started winning races.
Yeah, what happened was that after Governor Casey won, after it was Bob Casey at the time, became Governor Casey in '86. What happened was I started to get interest from media consultant firms, as opposed to just being a one-off and running a race and going to the next race. One of the top 2 Democratic firms, a firm called Doak and Shrum, uh, gave me a call and said they wanted to hire me to be an associate. So I moved to Washington D.C., where I ended up doing TV ads, speeches, debate prep, and strategic advice for a number of races. When you're a consultant, you're actually working a number of races, signing a bunch, hoping most of them win in the primary, if not all. Then you have them for the general election. So I went from state to state to state, doing ads, advice, debate, prep, speeches for different races.
I just want to go back to when you were on your losing streak. What was that like to lose campaign after campaign in terms of your self confidence and ego? And because those were high visibility losses, I'm sure it's not something you can hide, right? When you're losing a political campaign.
No, it's what you have to do is you still have to convince yourself to walk in the room like you're worth $1 million when you're worth about 15 cents. And confidence to me is something you project, and that even in the worst of the races, even when things were going bad, I would go in there and I would walk and I'd say, listen, even though I wouldn't say it, but even if Canada had no money, little chance, I would say, I know how to win this race. I've got the way to do it. Let me tell you and why you should trust me. And it's because the one thing that gets you ready to win a big race is having lost a race. And I learned from losing is what I would tell them. So by the time I lost, I think 23 straight, they must have thought I was the smartest consultant in political history.
So, how did you go from there to becoming a comedy writer and on Jay Leno's show?
When I was growing up, I'd always been fascinated by 2 things. One was the Tonight Show, and 2 was politics. And when I was in law school, I realized that you could basically go into the world of politics, which was a 300 night a year profession, or you could go into stand-up comedy, and which is also about 300 nights a year. So I ended up basically choosing politics. The truth is, I don't think I've been a very good stand-up, but I ended up choosing politics. But I always had that bug to write comedy. And then one day I read in the Washington Post. That was in the days when people actually read newspapers. I read in the Post that Jay Leno was coming to a theater called Wolf Trap outside Washington D.C. And I'm reading the article, and it said that he bought jokes from freelancers. He had not yet been named to take over the Tonight Show. I ended up calling NBC, getting someone in Jay's office who sent me a freelancer agreement. Now, what I didn't know was there was 900 freelancers, and if I knew that, I probably wouldn't have sent in any jokes. But I thought, oh, they must think I'm really special, and so I signed the agreement and sent in jokes, and I started sending them in. Jay was guest hosting one night a week, and then later a whole week a month for Johnny Carson before they named him to take over. He started using jokes, and then he called and said, "Hey, you want a job?" And I ended up, thinking about it, and there I was, with three young kids, and I was traveling. I think that one year, I had 270 flights, and I just made the decision. Well, let me try the comedy thing. But what I did is I told my partners in politics, I'll be back in 13 weeks because it's a 13-week contract, and there was no guarantee that it would work. Well, I ended up staying with Jay for 22 years.
So you weren't very good at predicting things.
I've been completely wrong my entire life. Let me just say that. The line I always use is, I'd rather be an effector than a predictor.
Do you remember the first joke you sent to Jay Leno?
Oh yeah, it was really stupid. When I say stupid, there's two types of stupid jokes: stupid as in stupid funny, that's really a good joke, or stupid as in it's really not a very good joke. This was the latter. It was, I think, July of '91, and there was a solar eclipse, total eclipse somewhere. And the joke went something like, there was a total solar eclipse today that throws all the animals way off. The chickens stop clucking, the cows stop mooing, the hookers come in on Times Square. And I was watching that night and watching TV, watching Jay, and all of a sudden I heard the joke. Yeah, wow, he did a joke just like mine. And then 3 days later, that big check for $50 came, which from where I'm sitting is still on the wall. Well, actually, not the check. I actually wanted to frame the check until my wife told me that's really stupid. Cash the check, frame the second part to it, which I did.
What was that like to get that first check from Leno for something that it was like a throwaway thing for you at the time?
Oh, it was a hobby. Yeah, it was someone who is a great someone who's an opera singer who decides they want to go play baseball and end up getting a hit. Oh, that's really interesting. It's a hobby. But as time went on, he used more and more. And actually, he called twice. He called first in, I think, January of '92. It was right after we had our third kid. And he said, I'm putting together my staff when I take over for Johnny in May. Would you be interested? And my belief is you always say yes. Yes, you're interested. You can always work out the details later. And then when he called back a month later and offered the job, it was like, okay, let me figure out how I can do both. And from May '92 until November, till the election, I did both my political clients and Leno. I went back and forth. I was LA to Columbus, Ohio, to New York, to South Carolina, to South Dakota, all over doing both, writing jokes on the way.
Did you always know that you were destined to be a comedy writer? I mean, were you funny as a kid? Were your parents funny? What was your childhood like?
It was My parents were lovely and the least funny people that ever lived. Um, just there's no other way about it. Were not funny. They were just normal parents. And I never forget when I got the job at the Tonight Show and told my mom that I was going to go out with Jay Leno and work there for 13 weeks. She said, "But you're not funny." I mean, my parents were inadvertently funny, especially my mom. And she would say things that were double entendres, but she thought it was a single non-sexual entendre, and we all laugh hysterically. But with comedy and whatever, I just always love comedy. I love comics. I love listening to them, and that was, I think, the drive. And just listening to the greats is what made me want to try to be funny.
Now, you had this very interesting nickname when you were young. You were called Ice Pick. What was that about?
Yeah, that was a little bit different. My dad was always perpetually either going about to go bankrupt or losing a car. He had a business. He had a soda business, an ice business, and a beer business. And what would happen is on the ice business, he had one of those ice machines which they don't have anymore, where you would put in 75 cents in change, and it would spit out a 10-pound block of ice or 10-pound bag of crushed ice. And when I was 8 years old, and what would happen is got very busy in the weekends, especially in the summer, people buying ice for their picnics, whatever. This was in Philly. My parents would drop me off at 8 in the morning outside the ice machine. My dad would do deliveries. My mother would handle the business. And I would be sitting there from 8 a.m. till about 5 p.m., just me, 8 years old, in a really rough neighborhood in Philly. And to give change. So people would come up, they need change, and I'd give it. Well, one time, guy came up, robbed me, took the money. I was 8 years old. So I came back and told my parents. And of course, the first thing my dad did was get upset. Yes. How'd you lose the money? Like, what was I supposed to do? So I said, well, I'm 8 years old, basically. What am I supposed to do? And their solutions were to give me an ice pick to stab whoever robbed me in the leg so that I could then run across, I can't make this up, a 4-lane highway to a car wash across the street where my dad would give them a case of beer once a week to look out for me on Sundays in case I was running wildly with a bleeding felon chasing me. So I was Ice Pick Johnny for quite a while, even at the age of 8. I never had to use it, luckily. Never had to use it.
I guess that began your comedy career.
Yeah, well, actually, it's interesting because what you do is when you're a kid put in a situation where you have to deal with adults, and a lot of them are drunk, and you're 8, and they're 45-year-old men, generally in a rough neighborhood. You learn to use your wits. You learn to be able to talk your way into anything and out of anything. And I think if there's a way that the genesis of where I learned to think funny or think fast came, it was probably in training that I don't think my parents ever anticipated. They just wanted me to give change.
So you were on Leno's show for 22 years, and you were the only writer to stay with him for the entirety of his hosting career.
There was two. We started with 8 writers. At times went up to 14, but for 22 years, 4,610 shows, there were two guys who made it the whole way. There's a guy named John Romeo, who's from Chicago, and me from Philly. I'm sure Romeo's name was probably Ice Pick John back in Chicago too.
And you came to be known as the joke machine, right? I mean, you throw me some stats here. How many jokes did you write a day over 22 years? How many of them made it on the air? I think you set some major records.
Yeah, well, I mean, here's the thing: there's some writers that will write 15 jokes in a day, and there'll be 12 will be awesome. That's not me. I deal in volume. And the only way I could really do it, and that really did it, maybe it's because I think fast, whatever. Maybe I don't put enough time into each joke. So I ended up writing about 100 jokes a day, plus what I would write for bits and sketches. So we kind of figured it out going back that I wrote about 500,000 jokes over the 22 years. And they did a count, and I think there was 18,000 that got on, which somebody told me, a couple of people said that's the all-time record. I mean, I guess if there's someone that probably has some app that can figure it out. But that means, an optimist says, oh my God, you got 18,000 jokes on. A pessimist would say, that means 482,000 jokes got thrown away. And that's probably what drives you as a comedy writer. It's how do I get on? And every night, if I had 4 jokes on a night, it was a great night. Jay would do a monologue, 23 to 32 jokes. So I've had 4 jokes on, great night. 3, good night. 2, fair night. 1, very depressed. None, I'd be suicidal. It'd be like hide the dog when I get home. And it averaged out because I remember one Monday I got 12 jokes on in a 22 joke monologue. And I think
Wow.
12 or 13. And I think what they told me was the record. And I thought, I am pretty good. And the next 3 nights I didn't get any on. So it averages out.
And what people may not know is that there's a lot of competition to get your jokes on. I think I read in your book that Leno read at least 1,000 jokes a day, and so yours had to be good enough. And there are a bunch of writers, right? So yours had to be good enough to make it through that pile, through the day, and on the air.
Right, and the one thing about Jay is it was there's some shows where it gets cutthroat. I know Saturday Night Live has a reputation for people fighting. Jay cultivated an atmosphere that it was just creative. You just turn in the jokes and let him pick. No one ever fought for their jokes. No one ever went in and said you didn't do my joke. And he never said he is, by the way, the nicest guy in the world. He never said to anyone, "Oh, you got to do better." It was just keep them coming, keep them coming. I'll figure it out. And the in fact, the only thing he ever said that even was remotely step it up, put it on himself. Like one morning I came in and he said, "I'm a little light today," as if it's his fault that the jokes that we've sent aren't good. And it made you want to. No one ever had to be told to write more on that show. Now, again, people wrote different amounts. Some wrote 20 or 30 a day. Some were like me, wrote a lot more. But it was, you had, like I said, when we started, we had 8 writers, and I think we ended up, at one point, we had as many as 18.
So it was pretty remarkable when you had one of those runs where you had three, four, five jokes, or even that day when you had 12 or 13.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, you feel like you're on top of the world. And then you realize that the show is a monster that eats up material. That as good as it was on a Monday night, you still have to do your 100 jokes Tuesday. You still have to write sketches. And as soon as it's done, whether that Tuesday night show is good or bad, you come back Wednesday. And it's 5 nights a week, and it was 47 weeks a year.
That's pretty insane. And you make it seem so easy. What was your workflow like? Your formula? I guess you start with newspapers, right? First thing in the morning and reading all the stuff.
I would start with a bottle of gin. I would drain it. Then I would go to the edibles. But on days when I didn't do that, I would. There wasn't edibles back then. It was old fashioned. It was old school. It was roll it up. But what I would do is this: on the way, I would get up, lay in bed for just 10 minutes or so, and just think. Okay, what are the stories from yesterday that can hold? Okay, then I get in the car. I listen to the radio, get into the office, and then I would, and it was completely arbitrary, but it was just my system, lay out 9 different topics of the day. And I'd look through the newspapers. So today, if it were today, for example, Chitra, we would say, okay, impeachment is a topic, and Thanksgiving's a topic, and the fact that the Cleveland Browns are good or bad is a topic, and the fact that Frozen 2 opened. So I'd write those topics down. Then I would start to write jokes connecting the topics, seeing if they worked, see if there was an association you could make. And you get 20 or 30 jokes out of that. Then I'd really start going into the newspapers. This was, again, the internet was, when we started, was obviously just starting. And I'd go to the newspapers, I'd read 4 or 5. And again, I'm not reading for depth. I'm reading for what's the stupid story. What's an interesting story? What's something that people will get that we can make fun of? And then later on, there was great websites like Fark and things like that. And there was the site aggregators where you could go and you could just look at the story quickly, see the headline, and say, that's something that I can make fun of. And by all of a sudden, you're done 100 jokes.
And what's interesting is how you connect two seemingly totally not seemingly, just totally unrelated topics, and then you give it a twist, and that turns into a joke.
Yeah, I mean, right now the would if you were to do something like that, because let's assume it's very cold. It's an LA show. It actually is very cold today here in LA, and you'd start out by saying amazing day, freezing cold this morning, down to 32. It was so cold that Rudy Giuliani and the special prosecutor huddled for warmth. You just mix, and they're called formula jokes, those, but they get you started so you can get to the smart jokes, the bigger jokes, um, things like that.
And in addition to writing for the Jay Leno show, you've written for 22 Academy Awards. You've written for the Golden Globes. You've written for the American Music Awards, and you've written for comedy specials, for roasts, presidential debates, and you've got different kind of frameworks for different genre, right, of each of those things.
Sure. First of all, I start with this: that no client too small, no fee too large. So if you start with that premise and you just say yes to everything, it makes it easy. I always say, kind of like a hooker or a taxi driver, everyone gets to ride. But if you're writing, for example, for an award show like the Academy Awards, whereas Jay is a topical monologue, and you're reacting off the news. With the Oscars, or the Academy Awards, you're going to be writing material about the movies of the year, about the show itself, about the nominees. It's self-contained. If you're writing for a comic, if you're writing for their stand-up act, again, that's then getting their voice. What is in their life? What is it they're communicating? And I call those, you do jokes, but you also have to think more thematically. Like if a comic has just gone through a divorce, let's talk about the divorce. What does it mean? How's it changed? How's it changed his or her life? So you really get the three different things. For me, a topical monologue is one thing, an award show monologue is another, and then there is the writing for a stand-up comic. With a lot of times they'll come, obviously many of them, with I want to talk about X, and then you can feed jokes that fit that thematic they're already thinking about.
You said in your book monologue, there's this big difference between like a late night show and the Oscars, where with the late night show you're trying out jokes on an untested audience before a few million people sitting on their couch, but with the Oscars you've got tens of millions of people and you're trying out untested jokes on them. What kind of pressure does that put on you as the writer?
Well, me, I just blame the other person who wrote it. So no pressure at all. But assuming that I have some kind of a little bit of pride left, um, the advantage of the Tonight Show, and that is that even if a joke, again, again, if you're a stand-up, you're taking your jokes out and testing them in the clubs, twice a night, 4 nights a week, maybe more over the course of months and a year. So you're tested, what's working. If you're a late night host, again, you're doing it for the first time, but you have that great advantage is if it doesn't work, you got to do it again tomorrow night. The stress with the Oscars is, or any major award show is, it's one shot. You don't get to the next night, do the Academy Awards again. You do it and it's one shot. You're hired for that year. You don't have a long-term contract. So you really, the stress is and the pressures on the host. But, for a little bit for me as a writer, it's, you always want to bring your A game, but I'll call it the difference between a marathon and a sprint. The Tonight Show is a marathon. The Academy Awards are a sprint.
And you've also learned to structure monologues differently based on a US versus international audience, like the time you went to Israel to help Jay Leno do his act over there.
Yeah, when you again, and that goes to the larger thing of know your audience, and this goes for whenever someone's in public, whenever someone's speaking, whether you are a comic, whether you are a CEO, whether you're giving a toast at a wedding, or I always say for a bachelor party, I always tell the best man, I said, whatever you think is funny is not. That private story of you and the bachelor, about to get married in Vegas, not only does no one know, whenever story somebody goes, well, you had to be there. Well, no, we're not there. You have to know your audience. And so that's the first thing. So when, we go to Israel, the jokes that Jay did had to be tailored to an audience that was, probably 40% Israeli, probably 25% European and Russian and part American. So what's a universal? What are things that everyone can get? What you have to make sure that everyone knows the topic. Because if you're in Israel and you do a joke about Lindsay Lohan, getting drunk the night before, they have no idea who Lindsay Lohan is, half the audience. But if you do a joke about a politician in Israel who got arrested and the joke is universal, and there's a great joke Jay did because there have been, I think, 4 or 5 Israeli politicians that have been arrested recently, right before the show. And he said, when you ask an Israeli politician his cell number, it has a totally different meaning. And that applied everywhere. People in Israel knew it meant a particular person, but the Americans knew it meant just corrupt politician. So that's the advantage there. So know your audience is my number one bit of advice for somebody.
And you also learned something interesting about audience feedback and the applause on these live shows and sort of the feedback that you get and how that relates to the being able to predict the direction of polls during a political campaign, for instance.
Yeah, it was interesting because I always said the Tonight Show audience was a nightly focus group of 400. This is the audience in the studio of 400, I'll call real people. You know what I mean? In the sense of
Hmm.
they weren't show business professionals, they weren't rich, it was a diverse crowd, but they were all kind of middle income people who work for a living. And here was their trip to LA, and they're getting to see a TV show. So I would find that they were ahead of the polls. So I'll never forget, it was probably, oh, geez, where was it? It was probably, well, it was July, August of 2008. And I had been helping out Barack Obama's campaign through my friend David Axelrod. And I remember calling David one day and say, when Jay starts a joke and he says Barack Obama, community organizer, people start to laugh before he gets to the actual joke. That's in the setup. Said, if they're laughing at you before the joke, there's a problem. And we started to see that over the next few weeks. Obama started to dip, not horrifically, but from two down, three down, four down, and then I'll never forget John McCain. I think it was September 15th, 2008. He made that comment about how the economy, with this when the economy was in horrible shape. He said the economy is in fundamentally good shape, and people laughed out loud. And the next night when you said John McCain's name, before you even got it, Jade would just start to go, well, Senator John McCain, and people would start laughing. And I called Axe and I said, it's over. We've won. Don't worry. We're good. But the polls didn't reflect it for about a week. It takes a little time. People get it. Audiences get it. And I would say you can never convince an audience of something that they will not believe. We cannot convince people right now that Prince Andrew is a good husband and a good father and a good person. We cannot do that. No matter what you say, I don't care what he does for the rest of his life, we cannot convince him. He has become the joke. And that's the one thing about comedy. You want to be the setup in the joke. You don't want to be the punchline.
And you said something really interesting in your book, which is that the reason stand up comedy works and people trust what they hear when somebody like Jay Leno says something is that there is this, it's true. There's a truth behind it. And in the audience may not loudly say it, but they are thinking it. And when Jay Leno says it, it becomes something that they trust because they've already been thinking about it.
Yeah, there's a couple of things. The first, the premise in the monologues in late night are always true. In other words, we're not making up the story. In other words, when we say that Donald Trump said X, we're not making it up. So the premise is true. So right there, they're actually getting a little bit of factual news. But also the idea, and especially when you build up trust like Jay did over the years, people understand that it's there. And there's an old saying that country music is three chords and the truth. Well, to me, jokes, a good late night monologue joke is a true setup, a premise, a twist that's believable, and then the truth. One of my friends on the Tonight Show for years, Wayne Klein, once said, all we ever do is rewrite the news. And that's a pretty good way of looking at it. Not the premise, but the twist on it, the way to look at it.
And you have this interesting way of describing it, which is the comma. If you hear somebody's name, comma, and that defines them, then they're in real trouble.
Yeah, it's you. Again, let's go back. This is years before you were born because you're such a young person. But Dan Quayle, we think of as Dan Quayle, comma, stupid because he misspelled potato. When you think of Bill Clinton, unfortunately for many people, they don't think of best economy in peacetime, peace. What did you hate more, the peace or the prosperity? You don't think of a president who did all he said in a good way. Unfortunately, you think, comma, affair. When you think of Donald Trump, let's say that you're a Trump supporter, which clearly I am not, but you're not going to think Dow Jones 28,000. You're going to think Donald Trump impeachment query. So you're going to you get that comma, and it's very hard to erase. So like I said, if you go to Prince Andrew now, it's not Prince Andrew, comma, member of royal family. It's Prince Andrew, Jeffrey Epstein.
How do you know what topics to stay away from or how not to go too far? And even stories like Jeffrey Epstein, there's a lot of tragic consequences for women with those Me Too stories. But the Harvey Weinsteins and Jeffrey Epsteins of this world deserve to be skewered. How do you balance that?
Ricky Gervais, who's brilliant, and I'm a huge fan, says the problem today is that people confuse the subject of the joke with the target of the joke. If I'm doing a joke that has the words with modern audiences, if I do a joke about Jeffrey Epstein or Prince Andrew or whatever, people, you automatically go, ooh, he's talking about, no, we're about to hit the target of the joke. The target of the joke is the bad guy, Harvey Weinstein, Jeffrey Epstein, uh, Prince Andrew. They're the bad guys, and people confuse it. So, which is my rule is, first of all, my rule used to be if the joke's good, say it. Now, in a day of cancel culture and people who looking to be outraged, sometimes I will tell a comic, look, this is a great joke. You laugh, I laugh. We know that 5 years ago, 10 years ago, it would, this joke would not get a blur, but someone's going to be offended by it, incorrectly offended by it. So is it worth it? And that, to be honest, that's a problem because comedy is supposed to push boundaries. Comedy is supposed to break down barriers. Comedy is supposed to make you think.
We're in this age of political correctness where it's very, very easy to offend someone very quickly and to have it go viral on social media and to even have yourself canceled, so to speak, in the halls of public opinion. And I think it was Chris Rock, you mentioned in your book, has said he doesn't want to speak on college campuses because young people are so sensitive and
Right.
politically correct today. And you've had a lot of comedians get in trouble over recent years. How
But
how do you?
yeah, I mean, to me, what I say is we're not offending them; they're being offended. They are the audiences today for many people are looking for the outrage. They're looking for the wait. He said the word race. He said, I mean, Sarah Silverman did a famous joke about rape years ago. Obviously, she's a feminist and a strong woman and is not pro rape. It was a joke. Do you know what I mean? Gilbert Gottfried is perhaps most famous, because at the roast of Hugh Hefner in 2001, in November, he did a joke about a plane flying into the Empire State Building, and there was dead silence. And he rescued it by telling a joke called "The Aristocrats," which is they even made a movie about the event and whatever. But today, unfortunately, you have to know your audiences, which is why if you're a brilliant comic like a Chris Rock or maybe a Jerry Seinfeld, you don't play to certain audiences because they're not going to get the jokes and they're going to be offended and it's not worth it. To me, honestly, I say let the marketplace dictate. If you're funny and you're telling good jokes, people will see you. And if your jokes are not funny and you're not making people laugh and people are not seeing you, then you're going to have to change your act.
In addition to writing comedy, you're also working as a political consultant, advising even some on the current slate of Democratic presidential candidates. How do you prepare for something like that?
I've always been a political junkie, and so I've always followed the news. I actually think, in an interesting way, that being a comedy writer has made me a better analyst of the political situation and better able to give advice because I'm not locked in that beltway mentality. I'm not locked in that the echo chamber of Washington D.C. and the beltway. I as a comedy writer, you're always looking at something with the question of what's odd about this? What's wrong about this? How can we poke fun of this? How can we poke a hole in it? Um, and so I think it's actually made it better. There's actually one point I wanted to go back to about, and we'll get back to this in a second about what we talked about, was in terms of the jokes and what can offend. I just always tell people who are listening and whatever is that if you think it's a problem, don't say it. And always remember that we don't want to punch, we don't want to make fun of victims. You would never have, you always want to make it clear that we're making fun not of Richard Jewell, which is what everyone did in the Atlanta bombing in 1996, but we're making fun of the bungling of the FBI. If this were happening today, you wouldn't be making fun of Monica Lewinsky. You would have all your jokes trained on Bill Clinton and the establishment and whatever. So again, the standards have changed in a good way for the better. I just wish the pendulum would swing a little bit back so people would understand that the target of the joke is who we're really after, not the subject.
What's it like working on current Democratic debates, given this huge slate of candidates up on stage? And you recently just got another one added to it, Michael Bloomberg. I mean, how do you even convey any kind of lasting punchline in your messaging with that kind of massive presence on stage with all these different people?
It's tough. I mean, the process they designed is silly. You know, this is just me, but instead of having a 3 hour debate with 12 candidates, how about 2 hour and a half debates with six? That's just me. I don't know if the math works, but it seems to me that everyone would then get their chance to shine in the sun more than the ridiculousness of seeing 12 people on stage. I mean, it looks like a. I was going to use the word a clown car, but my Democratic friends would be upset, but it's ridiculous. This process could have been fixed very easily right up front, but they bought into it, and I think it makes it very hard for some of the outstanding candidates out there to be heard. And I'm always one for new voices, diverse voices, voices that have not been heard before, and I think that they have been stifled by the debate process. And that's my 30-second political commercial right there. Go ahead.
If you you're looking at this age, golden age for political satire, right? With especially with President Donald Trump and impeachment and all this stuff, and you've got this new generation of late night hosts. How can you evaluate how they're each kind of approaching political satire in their monologues and their interviews?
Well, it's a lot different because we go back to Johnny Carson again, way before your time. But when Johnny Carson was there, he really didn't do political jokes. If he did, it was just an aside. Jay, you know, he came up or he took over in the day of the 24-hour news cycle and cable news. So there's a lot more stories. People are a lot more aware. But Democrats used to think Jay was a Republican, and and Republicans used to think he was a Democrat because he would poke fun at both sides. Somebody did a study and said he did 22,000 political jokes, 13,000 about Democrats, and 9,000 about Republicans. And the reason, when you think about it, for his 22 years, a Democrat was president for 13 years and a Republican was president for 9. So it's almost like he did 1,000 jokes a year based on the party. Well, not, it was mixed up all the time. And what you had then is, I think people were more likely to watch the news, and it was more. You would have rather watch our show, and people would watch it because you wanted to see what the comedy was, not for their point of view politically. We know what Stephen Colbert's politics are. We know what Jimmy Kimmel's are. We know what Bill Maher's are. Now, Bill is, of course, interesting because he's, I call him a libertarian contrarian. But in Jimmy Kimmel, I'm a huge fan of Kimmel, and I'm a huge fan of Bill. Um, but if you're watching Samantha Bee, you're watching Stephen Colbert, they're really good at what they do. But why would you watch it if you were an independent or Republican? You're not watching a late night show. You're watching a political thing. So it's just totally different.
One of the biggest game changers in this post, 24-hour news cycle world is of late night shows was, Jon Stewart. And you talk in your book about how polls showed that people trusted Stewart even more than network news anchors, and that in general, people trust the take of a Jay Leno or a Jon Stewart on the news more than the real news anchors. And that seems like such an indictment of the news business, but also a compliment to comedy writers like yourself. Why do you think there's been this shift
Yeah,
towards mistrust and cynicism of the news?
yeah, it's interesting. I would, again, the news was, of course, it was, there was three networks, and it was, you watch your news at night, and you watch the anchor, and that was that, and we would find sometimes they would make mistakes. What I think found is with the cynicism that came after September 11th, for whatever reason, the nutty conspiracy theories that came out above that. Jon Stewart and Jay Leno were voices of, I'll call it, reason. You turn to them, especially Leno and Letterman after September 11th. People turn to them. When there's an earthquake, our ratings would go up in LA because people would want to see, is it okay? What's going on? And I think, however, now I would love to see a poll, and maybe there is one. I suspect that is before people didn't trust the news, but they trusted their late night hosts. I suspect they don't trust anybody now. which is, why it would be so great to you know, have someone who was a bit more independent there, more of Stewart. Again, John got more political as the day went on, but in the early years or the early years of the first half, he was pretty much just poke fun of whoever's in charge. And that became a little more political as time went on.
Looking back on your career, do you have any closing thoughts on this world that you've been in for the past 22 years and the role that monologue has played in your life and stand-up comedy?
Yeah, I wish I had charged more, but my other closing thought, the true closing thought would be this: that all my life I wanted to, in a small way, affect change. And originally I thought I could do that through politics. One enters politics very idealistically, one always does, no matter what side you're on. You want to change the world for the better. You want to change it for your generation. And then at some point in my life, I realized I was getting a little bit cynical, that maybe it was more of a business as much as I believed in certain candidates. So I thought it was time to make a move. And maybe the way that I can affect change is in a world where we hear so much bad news, where there's so much tension. Maybe, and again, I'm not elevating me, I'm talking about comedy, that the ability or the willingness to try and make people laugh, and knowing that maybe in my case, that maybe I gave someone in those 18,000 jokes at least 8 laughs. If I could have done that, then I've affected change in that person's life for one day, rather than perhaps changing the world like it originally hoped. And that's not a bad way to go out, if that comes to that. That's my closing thought.
Well, thank you so much for joining me, John.
It was my pleasure. Loved it. You're fantastic, and I'd love to do it again.
Jon Macks is one of the greatest comedy writers of our time. Over 22 years as a writer on The Tonight Show with Jay Leno, Macks wrote 500,000 jokes, getting a record 18,000 on the air. He's also a political consultant, awards show writer, and has served on every Democratic presidential nominee prep team since 1996. Macks has written 5 books, including his most recent, Monologue: What Makes America Laugh Before Bed. Thank you for listening to When It Mattered. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or your preferred podcast platform. And if you like the show, please rate it 5 stars, leave a review, and do recommend it to your friends, family, and colleagues. When It Mattered is a weekly leadership podcast produced by Good Story, an advisory firm helping technology startups find their narrative. For questions, comments, and transcripts, please visit our website at goodstory.io or send us an email at podcast@goodstory.io. Our producer is Jeremy Kaur, founder and CEO of Executive Podcasting Solutions. Our theme song is composed by Jack Yeagerline. Join us next week for another edition of When It Mattered. I'll see you then.